The talk is titled Constitution Making in Contemporary Africa, with the subtitle, The Challenges of Democratic Transition, which is really the main theme of my talk. When we talk about transition, it implies a movement from point A in the present to point B, C, D in the unknown future. Africa, as I'm sure you're aware, is a continent that has been, for the most part, colonized by Europe. And so the African present, in all aspects, is a composite of two legacies: a colonial European legacy of the recent past, roughly 100 years, and also a pre-colonial African legacy, which is much, much longer. And the society itself, African societies themselves, are divided into a modern sector which has been developed during and after the colonial era, with a modern economy driven by a profit-oriented market economy, industries, plantations, mining, above all, a profit-oriented activity, mainly in the cities. And then in the countryside, reflecting the traditional sector, you have mainly a subsistence economy producing food for consumption. These two Africas are related, they are complementary. One cannot do without the other, like the old song, Love and Marriage. Like a horse and carriage, they can't have one, they can have none without the other. They are complementary, they are also contradictory or antagonistic. Why? Because the modern sector draws the vital, productive sector of society, the youth, the mining, plantation, and factories in the cities, in the urban areas, necessarily need the labor of young people. And so there's been a massive rural-urban influx over the last 30, 40 years, which has left the countryside with a considerable void, which has meant falling production of food, which has therefore resulted in famine. So famine in Africa, contrary to some of the impressions given by some press reports, is not caused because Africa is not sufficient, cannot produce sufficient food, or drought, although that also has been a cause. The main cause is because of the falling productivity caused by the departure of young people from the countryside. When people are engaged, as I was for 3 years, in making a constitution, which means really envisaging the future, which means outlining the most important, the most strategic questions affecting a country and trying to put them in the form of the constitution. You have to ask questions, you have to interrogate yourself. Constitution making is essentially a meeting point between the past and the present, in which there is a national interrogation, asking what is wrong, what is right, how do we preserve the good things and avoid the bad things, and how do we project the good things into the future. There are 5 main strategic goals in any constitution making that have to be considered, and that we considered in the Eritrean constitution making, and also in other constitution making experiences, Ethiopia, Uganda, South Africa, Ghana, Namibia. The first consideration is national unity and stability. Without stability, there can be no development. Secondly, sustainable development. Without development, producing enough to go around, law, justice, human rights would be more or less meaningless. So development, sustainable development, is a very important strategic goal that a country, a nation has to consider. Thirdly, and in my view, the main anchor of the whole thing is democracy. And I'm going to say more about that later on. Fourth, human rights and the rule of law. Now, these are, of course, found in Bills of Rights, so there'll be detailed sub-strategies, sub-goals, if you will, that are contained in the Bills of Rights. But I lump them together under the heading of human rights and the rule of law. And finally, last but not least, social justice. These are among the most important, if not the only important, considerations when one is looking at the present, considering the past, and looking into the future in constitution making. The way we did it in Eritrea was not to take a model, American, European, Japanese, whatever, and try to adapt it, impose it on the reality, Eritrean reality, but sort of disassemble the experience of others and extract from them the main things. I read the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers ad nauseam, again and again and again. I also read equivalent French literature, Le droit de l'homme et des citoyens, and Italian. I also happen to speak Italian. One of the consequences of being colonized is that you do actually benefit from learning the language. One of the advantages is that I can read Dante in the original. I can read Divina Commedia in the original. That's perhaps the only thing, the only advantage I got from the Italians. Instead of just adopting a model and trying to impose it on the reality, what we did was to look at the experience of other countries and ask a number of questions. The following are among the most important questions that we asked ourselves at the very beginning. First of all, what lessons, if any, do historical experiences offer in respect of constitution making? Looking at the experience of America, England, of course, doesn't have a written constitution, but it does have a set of statutes and laws that sum up becoming the unwritten constitution, France, and so on. And do such experiences yield helpful models for guidance? Thirdly, is it desirable or practicable to use models? Are they transferable like some technology? Fourthly, what, after all, are the values and goals that a nation needs most emphatically to promote, nurture, and protect? The 5 values or strategic goals I mentioned earlier on. And how should these be incorporated in a constitution? Fifthly, should such values and goals be so incorporated in a constitution, or should they be left to be determined in the crucible of political and social interaction, in the daily discourse of culture? Can we afford to leave it to chance like that? And our answer was no. We have to seize the bull by the horn, so to speak. 6, what form of government would be best suited for Eritrea? Now, that's an area where many countries have made a mistake. To begin with, what I call the Lancaster House model, under which British colonial legal officers drafted constitutions for their former colonies, then invited the leaders and gave it to them. I call it the Lancaster House model because it was negotiated in a place called the Lancaster House in London. It didn't work. It didn't work because it did not involve in the discussion, let alone the public at large, It didn't involve the elites. It was just given to them. And pretty much a few years later, it was abandoned, beginning with Nkrumah's Ghana's Nkrumah, who said, these are not our own making, so we will not accept them. So he chucked the British model and decided on a presidential and executive presidential model, which is also emulated elsewhere in Africa, with many problems, which I'll explain. What degree of decentralization should there be? Is federalism appropriate for a small country like Eritrea, with a comparatively cohesive society? And finally, should there be an official language or languages? If so, which ones do we select and why? I've been amused recently to hear some English American, Anglo-American, or what are the waspish nationalists crying out for an official language. Amendment of the Constitution to require English as the official language. I say I was amused because it didn't occur to the framers of the Constitution because there were Spanish-speaking people there at the time. There may have been a few German-speaking people in Pennsylvania, but not that significant. So it is now becoming an important political question whether to have more than one languages or whether to declare English as the official language. And by doing that, send a message to Spanish-speaking people and others. Samuel Huntington, a man I admire for his intellectual acuity, if not for his love of Africa, of third countries, has now written a book on this very topic. I haven't read it yet, but I read the review, and I'm going to read it. Apparently, he's now insisting that English should be required, should be an official language, and that the rest of the country, whatever origin country they come from, must be made to understand that this is it, it's the way to go. A kind of new ideology that recreates the old WASP ideology. I think it's inevitable that this will happen in America. I think it's inevitable because the reality suggests it. I also see Spanish-speaking people fitting into English because it's the way to go to advance their career. In the situation of Eritrea, where we have 9 language groups, but we have 2 prominent languages, Tigrinya, the language of the majority, and Arabic, the language of the Quran, of the half of the population, Eritrea being half Muslim, half Christian. There was a section of the Eritrean society that insisted that these 2 languages should be required, should be declared as official languages. This was resisted by the majority of us because our principle was, during the struggle, that there should be equality of languages as a principle. Even the smallest of languages, linguistic groups, must be made to understand that they belong, that they have value. And if we insist, if we provide for official languages, that will be derogating on or diminishing the value of that principle. Right now, it's going to be one of those things where I personally will accept a mistake, because the Arabic-speaking sector of our society is taking up this demanding Arabic as an official language. And unless this is done, there may be problems. So it's one of those things, I think, where an amendment of the Constitution will have to be made. Now, it was quite apparent at the beginning, from the very beginning, that not everything can be included in the Constitution, only the very fundamentals. I am an admirer of the American Constitution for its economy of language, for its conciseness, for outlining the very, very basic structure of government. It's the first constitution which turned the idea of science of government in the form of separation of powers in a constitution. But you know, of course, that separation of powers did not originate in America. It originated in France. Montesquieu, in his Esprit des Lois, enunciated the principle of separation of powers after he studied England as an exile, seeing that it was the idea of separate branches of government, independent of each other, that made England a much better place to live in than France. And the American revolutionaries, being astute men, learned men, some of whom read Latin and Greek, and my favorite statesman, who Catherine knows, I've said this time and again, Ben Franklin. I will call him Ben. Benjamin Franklin was, of course, there sitting and dispensing wisdom. So they then turned, like an engineer transforms a scientific discovery into practical use. They transformed the idea of separation of powers into a system of government. And I think the world is indebted to them for this, for many reasons, which I don't need to go into. There are certain things which we thought were important. One was we should not just adopt one model. We should inquire what would be the best way by asking questions. And secondly, no less important, was the participation of the public. To us, constitution making should involve the participation of the public. Historically, there have been three methods of constitution making. There's one that I call the Philadelphia method, which is familiar to you all, in which representatives of sectors of society, in this case the 13 colonies, are sent to deliberate on the Constitution, and then they go back and it is ratified by their constituencies. The fact that they did not involve the public, I don't think should be taken against them as a fault against them, because we should judge people only in terms of the times they were living in. The other one is what I call the parliamentary Westminster model, in which parliaments set up committees to review a constitution or revise it and submit to Parliament, and the larger House of Parliament, of course, decides on it. The third and the latest, now prevalent throughout Africa, and I think elsewhere, and the one we used, is with the Constitution model, the Constitutional Commission model. A commission representing stakeholders of society, trade unions, women, youth, business community, the intellectuals, and also where the society is divided into ethnic groups, all the ethnic groups and the religious groups represented in the commission. Now that commission, I insisted in our own case, once appointed, it has to be appointed by the political body. Somebody must appoint it, and in our case it was the parliament of the day, presided over by the president. It was a transitional parliament. But once appointed, I insisted when I was asked to head it, it should be autonomous. Nobody should tell the commission what to do, how to run its business, or how to draft the constitution. The draft can be thrown out, rejected, or accepted, but from the beginning to the end, there should be no interference of any kind. Why? Because apart from its representative nature, and therefore its constitutive nature, representing the society at large, it also enjoys in our case, professional autonomy. We were 50 people, members of the commission, and 10 out of the 50 were called the executive committee, which was the drafting committee, really. Both of them headed by the chief commissioner, the chairman, in this case myself, and the draft made by the executive committee was then submitted to the larger body, which was debated for many days, and then the outcome was published and distributed throughout the country, broadcast over the radio, In many instances, the main points were taken out in summaries and then translated into all the languages, broadcast, and then debates, town meetings and village meetings were held for 2 years. Then the result was collected, and the final draft was written and submitted to the National Assembly, the Parliament, which debated it, and with a few amendments passed it. And then it was submitted to a constituent assembly elected by the nation. And that was the ratifying body. In May 1997, the Constituent Assembly ratified the Constitution, and it became, it was adopted as the Constitution of the land, the first time that the Eritrean people, as a nation, adopted a constitution. Kaiteri was saying earlier on, there's been some disappointment. The man who was the leader of the revolution, and he was the president of the country, still is, unelected, but very popular, for some reason still unknown to me, decided to change his mind. He just shelved it, and he's ruling the country by decree. Somebody asked me, why didn't I go and advise him? Well, I could go and advise him, but I may not be able to come out. It has come to that, unfortunately. A very promising beginning, ended that way. Now, I'm going to shift here to the democratic challenge aspect of it. I think you've heard enough from me on the theoretical side. Democracy, as we all know, is the paramount value, political value of our time, of our epoch. By epoch, I mean 200 years. Even dictators pay lip service to it. Not to adopt democracy is to be against history, on the wrong side of history. As President Clinton reminded Jiang Zemin of China in his last visit here. You are on the wrong side of history. I don't think Mr. Zemin accepted it, but he was told in no uncertain terms that China will not be on the right side of history unless it adopts democracy, it allows the people to elect their representatives, and above all, have a constitution with fundamental rights written in it. The two go together. Constitution, democracy, and human rights go together. You cannot separate them. Now, in democracy, as we know it in the Western world, there are two aspects of it. Sometimes the first aspect is overemphasized, what I call the procedural aspect. Procedural in terms of how you send representatives, how you elect your governors. It's very important. How you elect your leaders is critical because they have to represent you. And by you, I mean the entire nation. So that is critical. But if emphasis is laid only on this, what I call the procedural or the methodic aspect, without taking due consideration of, so once elected, what do they do? What do they do? After all, the election is only a means to an end. And the end, of course, the function of representative institutions is what can be called the substantive aspect of democracy. What they do should be monitored by their constituencies, by society at large, by those sectors of society on whose shoulders has been fastened the important task of monitoring, holding government accountable. The representatives themselves, the media, free press, the various associations, professional associations, lawyers, doctors, teachers, women, and so on, what are called the stakeholders of society. On a daily basis, the government ought to be monitored and held accountable. And that is what I call the substantive aspects of democracy. In the African context, when the Europeans left, they didn't leave a democratic legacy. The governor of the colonial times were actually autocrats. They represented democratic countries, England, France, Belgium, Portugal perhaps not so, because Portugal was not democratic until the very last, the mid-1970s. But they were autocrats. Why? Because they had a mission. The imperial project was to organize yourself so as to extract maximum benefits from the colonial territories, maximize the profit through exploitation of labor and material resources with as cheap a cost as possible. To do that, democracy would not enable you, because people will begin to ask questions. That's one aspect of democracy which we may regard as messy. But then what about the others? What did Churchill say? Democracy is a bad form of government, but all the others are worse. In an African context, the messiness side of it is worth reflecting upon, because it has given democracy a bad name. To begin with, African societies are divided principally into ethnic groups. So ethnicity becomes the trumps any other ism, ideology, socialism, or whatever. And that has become a problem. So what leadership in Africa can do to obviate that problem, and there have been attempts. Socialism as an ideology was tried, representing the exploited class of society, the peasants, the workers, and so on. It didn't work. It didn't work because sooner or later, the leadership ended up abusing power, and so that also, socialism also had a bad name, got a bad name, all right? We are still struggling with what to do with democracy. Dictators have started actually coining new phrases to characterize the problems of democracy. They call it democratitis, like appendicitis or prostatitis. And what do you do with appendicitis? Appendectomy. So they've also spoken about democroctomy, cutting out democracy and having a clean, orderly government where the boss is obeyed. It's happening. It's happening. It's a struggle. Now, I'm going to give you a quote, one of my favorite quotes about the function of democracy, which I think is something that will endure. This is from a political philosopher, who was also a theologian, Jean Elstein of Chicago University. She says, democracy is not and has never been primarily a means whereby popular will is tabulated and carried out, but rather, and listen to this, a political world within which citizens negotiate, compromise, engage, and hold themselves and those they choose to represent them accountable for action taken. Democracy's enduring promise is that citizens can come to know a good in common that they cannot know alone. It's almost biblical. Almost biblical. And she's a theologian. In sum, I would say that democracy has come to Africa to stay, but it's going to be a long haul, long struggle. some have suggested that Africans should actually utilize the pre-colonial traditional forms of representation. We have chieftaincies, kingships in the rural societies. Why not tap on their genius, on the native genius, and use them for a good cause, at least in the rural areas? How can you do that? From the constitutional viewpoint, it's interesting because I actually created a board of advisors representing all the customary chiefs of Eritrea to see in what way customary law can be tapped and for which a place can be found in the constitution. And it proved to be very, very, very useful. For one thing, the representatives of these traditional leadership discovered that we care for them, that the government cares for them. So many of them said, really quite taken with the whole idea, we thought you forgot us. So now they have become, as a result, willing to cooperate with the government in law and order, in the collection of taxation, in reconciliation of conflict situations, both at individual level and at group levels. In the British colonial system, there was what they call the indirect rule. They used the chieftaincies. They even created chieftaincies, what they call the warrant chiefs, to do their bidding, to help them maintain law and order, to help them collect taxes, revenue, some of which were actually used to build prisons in which Africans were put. They used their money to imprison them. Now, that's the cynical side of it. But if you look at it from a more positive aspect, these institutions, which are vibrant, they're there. People respect them. People respect these chiefs in some areas, in many parts of Africa. How do you marry the old with the new? How can you utilize this traditional genius, customary law in institutions without in any way undermining the modern, progressive, secular aspect of democracy, in which equality is an important principle? If you build in your constitution systems that actually are not built on equality, because if you revere a chief, you are not his equal. So how do you reconcile these two seemingly opposed principles? That's one of the important questions. I would say this: you cannot constitutionalize these kind of problems. You cannot. You can give through a general phrasing by respect for tradition and so on, and then leave it to legislation, leave it to national as well as local legislation to take care of the practical side of it. In other words, there's a great deal of creativity needed in this. Nobody can give hard and fast rules. It's something which is very creative and very interesting. Some people questioned our claim that the public in Eritrea and other parts of Africa participated in a real sense in making their constitution. They said, this is just a myth, because you prepared all the texts, all the arguments, and then spoon-fed them. It's not true. It's not true. I traveled practically in every village, in every important village in the countryside. I almost lost my life, because in some of the desert areas where there was no clean water, I went for days without water, and one of my kidneys nearly burst. I was taken to hospital, flown to London, saved in the nick of time. You see, I have some purpose in life yet. And if the good Lord gives me more life, I hope to see an Eritrea governed by a constitution. But the people were earnest. At the beginning, they were timid. Many of them said, what do we know about the constitution? You just write and give it to us. They said, no, this is your property. And the idea of popular participation in making the constitution is not only, in fact, not primarily, to gain from the wisdom of the public, although there have been a few instances in which that happened. It is really to give them a sense of ownership of the Constitution. If the people believe they own the Constitution, they will fight for it. Many of them fought and are now in prison, unfortunately. But eventually, even that tragedy will, I think, turn out to be a positive thing when the public eventually become the owners of their lives, of their constitution and of their government. There were times when I was puzzled, amazed by some of the questions. There was a peasant in northern Eritrea, a Muslim, who, after I gave an expose of the idea of separation of powers, stood up to ask me a question. I happened to listen to the BBC, the Arabic program of the BBC, and as a result, I have learned a great deal, more than I was taught in school, more than your government has taught me. So, where do we fit in, the press, in this separation scheme of things? What is he talking about? The Fourth Estate. A simple peasant is asking the same question that those highly enlightened men asked in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. Amazing. There are also other elders who explained principles that we put in fancy terms in their own language, in their own vernacular. One of them actually, in rhyming couplets, explained to me the native idea of accountability and transparency in beautiful rhyming couplets in Tigrinya. And he said in the end, of course we have to have a strong government. A government has to have a strong hand. But a government is like a horse. It has to be harnessed. A horse that is not harnessed, he said, will go and take his master to the precipice. And governments are like that. They ought to be harnessed. What he's talking about? Accountability. So, there's a great deal that we learned, a great deal that one can learn from the people. Now, a Canadian scholar has put this question of sense of belonging in a nation, in the constitutional sense, as follows. His name is James Tully, Tullly. The question of our age is whether a constitution can give recognition to the legitimate demands of the members of diverse cultures in a manner that renders everyone their due, so that all would freely consent to this form of government, to this form of association. Let us call this first step towards the solution mutual recognition, and ask what it entails. And in Canada, of course, I think they're ahead of everybody else, of the world, certainly of this country, in terms of inclusion of every sector of Canada. Anybody who contests this can raise this in the question time. And I am willing to fight for Canada, tooth and nail. I think I'll stop here, and then perhaps entertain questions. Thank you.
And you did, from what I took from you, or what you're saying, that your commission was autonomous too. Now, how is that possible? Because once you have different parties represented in the commission, some of them have, of course, conflicting agendas, and at the same time, they're not equal parties. The youth represented there, of course, have no challenge to the state represented there, and that I'm talking of Afghanistan, which was basically the same commission, virtually the same system. Now, of constitution drafting, and I think we saw that it's not autonomous in a sense, because at the end of the day, what the state wants in the system, what the way it wants the system, well, get it out of that. But it's only that they will legitimize it. Did that happen in the area, or it was an autonomous commission bringing out what the people want, or what the dispersed out would work well?
A good question. A good question. If there is an agreement, as in the case of Eritrea, between the constitution makers, the commission represented by the chairman, and the head of the government, that once appointed, the commission will be autonomous in procedural terms, in terms of how it organizes its work, what kind of questions it asks, how it runs its business, and above all, in how it drafts the constitution. Once that is done, of course, the government can either accept or reject the final product. In Eritrea, there was no form of there was no type of instruction or interference. There were only 2 or 3 occasions on which the president and I, we didn't cross swords, but he raised some questions. And we met, and I explained to him, and he grudgingly accepted. And there were times when he thought that we were paying too much attention to Eritreans in foreign lands, because one of the very important aspects of the constitution making in Eritrea, which I recommended in the Afghan stage, by the way, I was one of those who was asked as an expert, gave my views to this guy in New York University, forget his name, and also in Iraq, the large community in the diaspora have a fund of knowledge and connections, so it'd be a great pity to miss them. It's very important to involve them in the making of the constitution. I don't know whether they accepted it, but certainly in our case, we have a very large Eritrean diaspora in North America, Canada, and the United States, totally something like 150,000. In Europe, about the same, more perhaps. And these are some of the most highly educated people. So we organized them. In fact, 3 of them became members of the commission, my commission. All 3 of them in the United States. And they organized meetings here, and they got wonderful ideas coming from society. Now, why the president decided in the end to shelve a constitution that he indirectly anyway helped create and that he accepted is beyond me. It's one of those things which one day historians will fathom. Some people think because he is a control freak, he doesn't want to abandon power, and that the constitution, of course, envisages a multi-party democracy, and that he might lose, which may be the case. So, to answer your question more concisely, I would say that there's always a possibility of interference. There's always a possibility of contending views within the commission itself, and that the more the merrier. There were, in the commission itself, tremendous debates, sometimes even fights on issues. And that's good, that's good. But I think any constitution maker, or member, or leader of a commission that really thinks of doing something useful has to extract from the powers that be a promise of non-interference. Because once the constitution is drafted, it takes a life of its own. It's very difficult to change, especially if the people participate in its making. Okay? Yes?
I have a question with regard to democracy. You said that democracy often doesn't work in Africa because it divides along ethnic lines. I was wondering why that was so different in Africa, as in if it's inherent to democracy that divides along ethnic lines, why haven't we seen such a division in Western countries, let's say? so do you think there are certain prerequisites to have the democracy established? And what are other consequences of establishing a democracy when there are ethnic cleavages of white women work, other characteristics of it? And with regards to your quote of Churchill, do you believe that it's possible to find a system that is better than democracy and would work better in Africa?
Well, some suggestions. To answer the last question first, there have been some suggestions of adapting African institutions, precisely in answer to your question, that perhaps one way of solving the problem of division along ethnic as well as other lines is to use the native or traditional power systems. But there are many problems in that respect, because you will be diluting some of the fundamental concepts of democracy. The notion of equality. Equality is fundamental. And in some of these traditional societies, women have no place, or at least they have a subordinate place. And it is an article of faith of modern progressive constitutions that equality would include women. And in Islamic societies in particular, are you from Afghanistan? Well, I know you will bear witness to this. Women are not having the best of situations in Islamic countries. And I asked some of my friends, some of the Islamic scholars, friends of mine, whether there's anywhere in the Quran which actually subordinates women to those of men. And they said no. The Quran doesn't prescribe subordination of women, not even Sharia, which is based on Quran and on the sayings of the Prophet. It is societies, leaders of societies, that created inequality, and this actually differs from place to place. There are parts of the Islamic world in which women have equal rights, but by and large, I think the Sharia, in practice, prescribes certain biases that go against women. In case of divorce, for instance, they only take a third of the property, and the husband has the right of custody of the children. Okay, so your first question, I don't know. I think if democracy is applied in the right way, which requires good leadership, good imaginative, honest leadership, incorruptible leadership, which gathers around it representatives of the various societies. In this respect, perhaps the proportional representation system of election may achieve part of the objective, because it tends to be representative of all sectors of society, including minorities. One can think of other methods also. So, ethnicity or the multiplicity of ethnic groups does not in and of itself mean that it's going to be against democracy. I think it's what we make of democracy as human beings, as leaders, that matters.
So would you say that the leaders in Africa have emerged out of this process of democracy have been very incompetent?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Incompetent is perhaps even a very lenient word. They've been corrupt. They've been corrupted by power. Many, if not all, African leaders have used their political power to accumulate vast amounts of wealth. And that, of course, has meant that they used their positions to help their kinsmen. That's where ethnicity comes in, and their friends from their political parties. So corruption is a problem. How you hold leaders accountable and the principles and mechanisms of making them accountable is going to be a key towards resolving this problem. Okay.
We also witnessed.
No, let her ask the final question. I see her burning with some.
You'll also get a chance to talk to him at 3:30.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right.
So.
Any other question? Yes.
How many of the 9 Eritrean languages was the Constitution translated into?
The main languages which the majority of people speak are Tigrinya, Tigray, Kunama, Saho, Arabic, of course. These are the main 5 of the 9 languages. Everybody speaks these 5 languages.
And what kind of issues did you have having it be consistent yet written in 5 different languages?
I'm not clear about the question.
Well, something is written in a different language. It's not the same exact word, so it could be interpreted differently.
Okay. Oh.
It's not always exact translation.
We had several international legal instruments, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, the UN Charter itself, the 1966 covenants, the political and civil rights, and the economic, social, and cultural rights. All of these were translated into Arabic and Tigrinya. It would have been too costly to translate them into other languages. But many of the documents that we ourselves produced, condensed versions of what principles of separation of power means and human rights and so on, was translated into the 5 languages and broadcast over the radio. In our type of societies, it's an oral society. Only 30% of the population can read. So radio is critical. We use radio. We also used theatrical models of people enacting ideas. And we invited the poets, the dramatists, novelists of the country to compete for this. And a great deal of money was spent on this. And by the way, I raised something like $4.5 million from the US, from the Scandinavian countries, and from some non-government organizations. So there was no problem of money. And we also involved the youth in secondary schools and university in periodic debates on a number of issues. The thing about the young is that they take their passions and their ideas home, and they convert their parents. They become the apostles, so to speak, of ideas. And it was an extremely exciting thing to behold, parents coming to us and telling us their children taught them things. I didn't hear it, sorry.
She says, could there be a non-democratic system of government that could be possible in Africa? Is that right?
Yeah.
Successful long-term. And she's the last question.
It would be a contradiction in terms if I were to say yes, because my belief in democracy is such that in the long term it will succeed. Why? Because it involves the people, the people. With all its messiness, I am Churchillian in this sense. With all its messiness, is the best form, better kind of government that humanity has discovered so far. And the Chinese, 15, 20 years down the road, will be forced by their young to be democratic. So I don't think so. The thing is this, if an enlightened dictator actually takes steps that will improve the lives of people, as some of them can do, it will not last long, because dictatorship by definition means favoring only a few, and that brings corruption. In time, it will be so corrupted, they will be overthrown. It has happened everywhere in Africa.